The air in the maintenance bay at Forward Operating Base Dagger was a thick cocktail of smells, a permanent olfactory record of desperation and toil. It smelled of ozone from stressed electrical conduits, of hot metal and burned lubricant, and beneath it all, the ever-present, cloying sweetness of diesel fuel that clung to everything like a second skin. Grit, fine as powdered sugar, and carried on the ceaseless wind from the surrounding gray desert, settled in a thin film over every surface, finding its way into the gears of machines and the lungs of men. The light was a harsh, unforgiving yellow, cast down from caged fluorescent tubes that hummed a monotonous, soul-crushing drone, a sound that became the background music to every waking and sleeping moment. This was a place of function over form, a purgatory of steel and concrete where machines were healed and men were worn down. It was a kingdom of noise, the clang of dropped wrenches, the scream of plasma cutters, the percussive blast of pneumatic tools, a constant, chaotic symphony of repair. And in the center of this kingdom, Staff Sergeant Rex Thorne held court. Thorne was a man built to the specifications of the bay he ruled. He was broad and thick, with a neck that seemed to have been borrowed from a bull, and hands that looked less like flesh and more like collections of worn leather and scarred knuckles. His face, weathered and sun-beaten into a permanent scowl, looked like it had been carved from naval tradition itself, a monument to grit and grievance. Authority radiated from him, but it was not the quiet, confident heat of a furnace. It was the sputtering, unpredictable flare of a welding torch, loud and dangerous and demanding attention. He moved through the cluttered space with the proprietary swagger of a man who believed with every fiber of his being that this was his world, and everyone else was merely a guest, and a frequently unwelcome one at that. His voice was a gravelly roar that could cut through the din of the machinery, a tool he used to cajole, to berate, and to dominate the crew of younger, less certain mechanics who orbited him like nervous moons. To them, he was a font of profane wisdom, a master of the mechanical arts whose approval was a rare and precious commodity. From his flawed, limited perspective, the world was a simple hierarchy. There were predators and prey, hammers and nails, leaders and followers. He was, in his own mind, a predator, a hammer, a leader. And he judged all others by their immediate superficial utility and their adherence to his unspoken code of conduct. This code was a brutish tapestry woven from threads of casual misogyny, unquestioning adherence to tradition, and a deep-seated suspicion of anyone who did not look, sound, and act exactly as he did. Intellect was suspect, silence was weakness, difference was a threat. His worldview was a fortress built of simple, sturdy prejudices, and from its ramparts, he saw everything with perfect, unshakable clarity. He was a product of an older, harder institution, one that was slowly being eroded by new ideas and new types of people, and he fought this erosion with the stubborn, unthinking ferocity of a seawall against a rising tide. And then she had arrived. She was a quiet anomaly, a disruption to the bay's harsh ecosystem. She had been introduced on paper as Warrant Officer Anya Sharma, attached to the unit for a special technical evaluation. But to Thorne, the paper meant nothing. What he saw was a woman, small and unassuming, with a frame that seemed too delicate to wrestle with the monstrous engines of war that were his daily bread. She wore standard grease-stained coveralls that hung loosely on her, obscuring any hint of femininity and rendering her almost anonymous. She did not speak unless spoken to, and when she did, her voice was low and even, devoid of the bravado and bluster that Thorne equated with competence. For days she had simply observed, her dark eyes moving with a slow, methodical patience, taking in the flow of work, the diagnostics, the repairs. She carried a small, hardened data pad, but more often than not, she just watched, her hands in her pockets, her expression unreadable. This stillness was, to Thorne, a profound and infuriating insult. It was the calm of a placid lake in his world of violent storms. He and his crew saw it as weakness, as uncertainty, as proof that she was another box ticker from headquarters, sent to get in the way and generate useless reports. Her silence was not the respectful quiet of a subordinate, but the alien quiet of an observer. and it made the hairs on his thick neck stand up. She did not fit. She did not belong. The ultimate symbol of her otherness, the thing that had finally pushed Thorn and his cronies from simmering resentment into open hostility, was her hair. It had been long and dark, a single thick braid that she kept tucked neatly away. It was the one feature that stood in stark contrast to the grime and machinery, a detail of softness in a world of hard edges. So, as a lesson, as a welcome to his world, they had cornered her. It was not a violent act, not in the physical sense. It was something far worse, a ritual of humiliation. They had held her, not with brutality, but with the sheer weight of their numbers and their certainty. And with a set of clippers powered by a portable generator, one of his corporals, egged on by the laughter of the others, had shaved it all off. They had expected tears or screams or a desperate plea. They had expected a satisfying emotional collapse that would affirm their dominance. They received nothing. She did not struggle. She did not flinch. She did not turn. She simply stood there, her eyes closed as the dark braid fell to the greasy concrete floor. When they were done, her head was a map of pale skin, exposed and raw under the yellow lights. She had opened her eyes, looked not at them but through them, and then had walked away without a single word. Her lack of reaction had been more unsettling than any outburst. It was a lioness allowing a jackal to dance at the edge of its kill radius. They had laughed it off, calling her a robot, a freak. But the victory felt hollow, the laughter strained. They had marked her, but the mark did not seem to take. She wore her shorn head not as a brand of shame, but as she wore her coveralls. A simple, functional fact, unworthy of comment or emotion. Now, 2 days later, the tension in the bay was a palpable thing, a low-frequency hum beneath the noise of the machines. Thorn watched her as she stood by a disassembled turbine assembly, her gaze fixed on the complex array of stators and blades. He saw her shorn head and felt a surge of proprietary pride, the satisfaction of having put someone in their place. But a deeper, unacknowledged part of him was unnerved. He had expected her to file a complaint, to run to the base commander, to do something. Her continued unnerving silence felt like a judgment. Still staring, Sharma? Thorn's voice cut through the air, a deliberate disruption aimed directly at her. Several of the younger mechanics paused their work, their eyes flicking between the two of them, sensing the next act of the drama was about to begin. They were the chorus, the onlookers, their silence a form of complicity. She did not turn immediately. She finished her slow, deliberate visual scan of the turbine's interior, then finally pivoted, her movements economical and unhurried. Her eyes met his. They were calm, analytical, like the lenses of a complex diagnostic machine. I am observing a potential microfracture in the third-stage compressor blade, Staff Sergeant, she said. Her voice was flat, a simple statement of fact. The technical accuracy of her statement was a minor annoyance to Thorn. He didn't care about the blade. He cared about the hierarchy. He took a step closer, deliberately invading her personal space, using his physical bulk as a weapon. Quote 3. He gestured vaguely toward her head, a smirk playing on his lips. His cronies snickered on cue. She did not step back. She did not even blink. It was as if his physical presence registered to her as nothing more than a change in air pressure. Her use of his full rank and name was precise, clinical, and infuriatingly formal. It was a subtle rejection of his attempt to create an informal, dominance-based dynamic. He felt a flash of hot anger. This was not going according to the script. She was supposed to be intimidated. She was supposed to be broken. Quote 5, he scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl that was nonetheless loud enough for the whole bay to hear. Quote 6, to emphasize his point, he reached out and slammed a heavy, grease-smeared toolbox down on the workbench next to her. The clang of metal on metal was sharp and violent. It was a calculated act of intimidation, a display of casual strength and explosive temper. The chorus of mechanics flinched. Sharma did not. Her eyes tracked the toolbox, noted its landing, and then returned to his face. There was no fear. There was no anger. There was only a quiet, unnerving stillness. It was the calm of a bomb disposal expert studying a complex device, a focus so absolute that it left no room for emotion. She seemed to be looking at him as she had looked at the turbine, as a system to be analyzed, a problem to be solved. And in that moment, she delivered a response that was so simple, so devoid of emotion, it was more powerful than any threat or insult could ever have been. A single word. It hung in the air, a perfect, crystalline sphere of defiance. It was not shouted. It was not whispered. It was stated. A fact. Thorne felt a vein throb in his temple. His entire methodology of dominance was based on a predictable pattern of action and reaction. He applied pressure, and the object of his pressure would either break, bend, or push back in a way he understood. This woman, this anomaly, was doing none of those things. She was simply absorbing the pressure, her stillness, an absolute negation of his power. It was like trying to punch water. He was off balance, his aggression finding no purchase, and it was making him furious. He opened his mouth to escalate further, to unleash a torrent of verbal abuse that would finally crack her placid exterior, to perhaps even cross a line into a physical shove. But the world had other plans. It began not as a sound, but as a feeling, a subtle, low-frequency vibration in the concrete floor, a change in the quality of the air. The harsh yellow lights in their cages flickered once, twice, then seemed to dim, their steady hum turning into a strained, sickly buzz. Outside, the perpetual wind, the constant companion of life on Phobia B Dagger, began to change its tune. Its low moan escalated into a rising shriek, a keening wail that seemed to tear at the very walls of the maintenance bay. The mechanics, their attention snapped away from the human drama, looked up at the high dust-caked windows. They were no longer seeing the familiar gray expanse of the desert. They were seeing a roiling, churning wall of absolute brown, a solid entity of sand and fury that was descending upon them with impossible speed. A haboob. But this was no ordinary storm. This was a monster, a biblical event of wind and grit. Then came the alarms. A series of frantic, overlapping sirens began to blare across the Phobia, their electronic screams barely audible over the roar of the wind. The red crisis lights inside the bay kicked on, bathing everything and everyone in a hellish, pulsing crimson glow. Simultaneously, the main power grid, stressed beyond its limits, gave up the ghost. The humming fluorescent lights died with the final pathetic pop. The bay was plunged into a momentary, terrifying darkness, broken only by the strobing red emergency beacons. A heartbeat later, the three massive backup generators that were the heart of Thorne's kingdom roared to life with a deafening, guttural cough. For a moment, there was a collective sigh of relief. The primary lights flickered back on, albeit with a noticeable tremor. But the relief was short-lived. A cascade of angry beeps in high-pitched warning tones erupted from the main control console that monitored the generators. One of the mechanics, a young specialist named Miller, scrambled to the panel, his face pale in the flickering light. Rob Miller's voice was tight with panic. Quote 9. Thorne shoved his way to the console, his personal conflict with the Sharma instantly forgotten, replaced by a surge of adrenaline and professional pride. This was his domain, his crisis to manage. He roared, his voice a familiar beacon of command in the growing chaos. Miller yelled back, his fingers flying across the touchscreen. Wells at 12 of the panic, cold and sharp, began to cut through the Thorne's bluster. The emergency protocols were designed to be foolproof. If they were failing, it meant the situation was spiraling out of control far faster than he could have imagined. The roar of Generator 2 was changing, its steady rhythm developing a sick, grinding shudder that vibrated through the floor. The lights flickered violently, threatening to die again. He knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, what was happening. A runaway generator under full load without coolant would, in a matter of minutes, tear itself apart in a catastrophic explosion of shrapnel and fire. And Generator 3's voltage spikes were poison to the FOB's sensitive electronics. If it continued, it would fry the entire command and control network, rendering the base deaf, dumb, and blind. They were not just losing power, they were on the verge of losing the entire base. His reaction was pure instinct, born of years of by-the-book training. He bellowed orders, his voice cracking with a frantic energy that betrayed his fear. His men scrambled to obey, but their movements were clumsy, panicked. They were following procedures that were no longer relevant, shouting over each other, their actions adding to the chaos rather than diminishing it. Thorn himself, the great king of the maintenance bay, was reduced to a state of loud, ineffective rage, yelling at machines that would not listen and at men who were too terrified to think. He was a creature of process and procedure, and in the face of a crisis that had leapt outside the bounds of his manuals, he was utterly, hopelessly lost. His authority, which had seemed so absolute moments before, was revealed to be a hollow shell, shattered by the first real test it had ever faced. And in the heart of this maelstrom of noise and fear and failing machinery, Anya Sharma moved. The shift from stillness to action was so sudden, so fluid, it was as if a statue had come to life. She did not run. She did not shout. She moved with a preternatural grace and economy of motion, a dancer weaving through the chaos. Her eyes, which had been calm and analytical before, were now lit with an intensity that was terrifying and beautiful to behold. It was the look of a grandmaster seeing the entire board 10 moves ahead of everyone else. She flowed past the panicked mechanics, ignoring their frantic, useless activity. She arrived at a secondary control panel on the far wall, one that was rarely used, covered in a thin layer of dust. Her fingers flew across its interface, not with the panicked slapping of Miller, but with the delicate, precise touch of a concert pianist. A schematic of the entire power grid bloomed on the screen, a complex web of lines and nodes. But she wasn't looking at the main conduits. Her focus was on a series of thin, redundant lines, maintenance access relays that were, according to every manual, not meant to carry a primary load. Miller, she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the din with the clarity of a scalpel. It was a voice of such pure, unshakable command that the young specialist froze, his head snapping around to look at her. Disable the primary bus bar interlocks. Authorization code 99 Delta Victor Tango. Miller stared, dumbfounded. Ma'am, that's a level 5 diagnostic code. We're not authorized. And disabling the interlocks it could cause a feedback loop that would blow the whole grid. It won't, Sharma stated, her eyes never leaving the screen, because we are not going to use the grid. Not your grid anyway. Do it. Now. Something in her tone, a complete absence of doubt, compelled him. His fingers shaking typed in the code. A series of red lights on the main console turned a steady, ominous yellow. Thorn, she said, her voice still level, still impossibly calm, get me a C47 spool of high amperage triphase cable and a portable plasma cutter. I need a direct, hardwired bypass from Generator 1's primary alternator to the C4I substation's seismic damper feed. We are going to perform emergency surgery. Thorn was frozen, caught between the ingrained habit of command and the shocking reality of being commanded. The jargon she was spitting was a foreign language of expertise, a level of systems knowledge that went far beyond mere maintenance. A seismic damper feed? That was part of the building's structural integrity system. It had nothing to do with power distribution. Or so he thought. He found himself moving, his body responding to her authority before his mind could process the insurrection. He and two other mechanics wrestled the heavy spool of cable from its rack, while another fired up a plasma cutter. Sharma met them by the howling, shaking housing of Generator 1. She pointed to a thick armored conduit. She commanded. It was insane. It was brilliant. It was something that could only have been conceived by someone who didn't just know the system, but understood its soul, its hidden pathways, and forgotten possibilities. While the mechanics cut through the pipe, she was already at the access panel of Generator 1, her hands ablur as she disconnected the main output feeds. Sparks showered around her, but she did not flinch. She worked with a serene, focused violence, deconstructing and reconstructing the heart of the base's power system with the confidence of a god rearranging the stars. The onlookers, the chorus of mechanics, were now silent. Their panic had been replaced by a profound and humbling awe. They were witnessing a masterclass, a level of competence so far beyond their own understanding that it felt like magic. They watched as she single-handedly rerouted the entire power flow of a multi-million-dollar facility improvising a new circulatory system from spare parts and forgotten pathways, her mind working at a speed that was simply incomprehensible. Thorne, his face streaked with sweat and grime, held the heavy cable as she prepared to connect it, feeling less like a staff sergeant and more like a lowly apprentice. He was watching her, this small, quiet woman with the shorn head, and the foundations of his world were crumbling. His entire concept of strength, of authority, of competence, was being rewritten before his very eyes. The jackal had stopped dancing. It was now staring, paralyzed, as the lioness revealed the true, terrifying extent of its power. The air crackled as she made the final connection. For a terrifying second, the lights died completely, plunging them into absolute blackness. The only sound the screaming of the wind and the dying groans of the failing generators. A collective gasp went through the bay. Then, with a solid, definitive thump, a new circuit was born. The lights in the maintenance bay came back on, not flickering, but shining with a steady, clean brilliance. On the main console, a sea of red warning lights vanished, replaced by the cool, reassuring green of stable power. She had not just saved the generators. She had bypassed the damaged central controller entirely, isolating the failing units and routing the power from the single stable generator directly to the base's most critical systems: the command bunker, the communication arrays, the perimeter defenses. She had done it in under 4 minutes. The roar of the wind outside was still a terrifying symphony of destruction, but inside the bay, there was a sudden, reverent silence. It was broken by the sound of the main bay doors being forced open against the storm. Two figures stumbled in, silhouetted against the swirling, brown chaos, their forms haloed in dust. One was the phobie commander, Colonel Matheson, a man whose face was a permanent mask of weary frustration. The other figure was taller, leaner, and moved with an unmistakable coiled energy. He was Master Chief Petty Officer Elias Vance, a man who was less a soldier and more a living piece of institutional history. His face was a roadmap of a dozen forgotten conflicts, and his eyes held the quiet, unshakable authority of someone who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing. Colonel Matheson's eyes swept the scene, taking in the dead generators, the discarded tools, the scorch marks on the floor, and the one bank of lights burning with impossible stability. "What in the blue hell happened here, Thorne?" he demanded, his voice hoarse from the wind. "My entire command board went black. Report!" Thorne opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he say? He, the master of this domain, had been a helpless bystander. He had failed. He was about to stammer out some excuse when Master Chief Vance's eyes found the small figure standing beside the humming generator. Vance, who had been striding into the room with the weary impatience of a man responding to yet another crisis, stopped dead. His body went rigid. His eyes, which had seen warlords and admirals with equal impassivity, widened, first in disbelief and then in something that looked like profound, unadulterated reverence. He ignored the colonel. He ignored Thorne. He ignored the smoking machinery. His entire universe contracted to focus on the unassuming woman in the grease-stained coveralls. He took one more step forward, his boots coming together with an audible crack. His back went ramrod straight. He raised his hand to his brow in a salute so sharp, so precise, it seemed to cut the very air. "Attention on deck!" Vance's voice was not a shout. It was a physical event, a concussive blast of pure, undiluted authority that dwarfed Thorne's earlier roars. It was a sound forged in decades of command, a voice that could stop a riot or launch a fleet. The mechanics, already in a state of shock, reacted on pure instinct, their bodies snapping to attention, their hearts pounding in their chests. Colonel Matheson stared at his Master Chief, utterly bewildered. "Vance, what in God's name are you doing? At ease. I'm talking to—" "Ma'am," Vance said, his voice now low, respectful, his eyes locked on Sharma, his salute unwavering. I apologize. I did not realize you were on this station. Your name wasn't on any special personnel manifest." Sharma looked at the legendary Master Chief. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "My presence here was on a need-to-know basis, Master Chief. You can stand at ease." Not until the colonel understands, ma'am, Vance replied, his gaze still fixed. Matheson's face was a storm of confusion and dawning indignation. He was a full colonel. Master Chiefs did not ignore him. He turned his glare from Vance to the woman. He saw the shorn head, the generic coveralls. Who is this, Master Chief? This is the warrant officer assigned for the evaluation, is it not? What is going on? It was in that moment that the final devastating truth descended upon the maintenance bay. Vance took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with an awe that bordered on religious. Colonel Matheson, he said slowly and deliberately, so that every single person could hear and understand. You are looking at Chief Warrant Officer 5 Anya Sharma, but that's just the name on her uniform. To those of us who have worked in joint special technology and infrastructure projects for the last 15 years, she is known by another name. Sir, that is Daedalus. The name fell into the silence like a bomb. It was a code name spoken only in whispers in secured facilities and black site development labs. It was a legend, a myth. Daedalus was the ghost in the machine, the architect of the military's most advanced, most secret, and most resilient technological systems. Daedalus designed the uninterruptible power grids for nuclear command bunkers. Daedalus wrote the encryption algorithms for drone fleets. Daedalus created the stealth systems that made entire battle groups invisible. Daedalus was not a person. It was a force of nature, a mind so brilliant it was treated as a strategic national asset. And Daedalus was supposed to be a myth, a collective noun for a team of shadowy geniuses at DARPA. Not her, not this quiet, small woman. The narrator's voice, for a moment, could have filled the stunned silence, listing the litany of her accomplishments as if reading a citation for a god. The Presidential Medal for Technological Achievement, the Distinguished Service Cross for her actions during the Tehran cyber crisis, where she single-handedly defended the nation's financial infrastructure from a state-level attack. The classified commendations that would never see the light of day for projects that officially did not exist. She held more patents for classified military technology than any single living individual. The very power grid that Thorne had claimed as his kingdom, the grid that had just failed so spectacularly, was a 10-year-old, stripped-down commercial variant of a system she had designed in her early 20s. She knew its every strength and, more importantly, its every flaw because she had created them. Thorne felt the blood drain from his face. The world tilted on its axis. Every arrogant word he had spoken, every condescending gesture, every snickering insult played back in his mind, now cast in a horrifying new light. The shorn head. He and his men had taken Shears to a living legend. They had mocked and humiliated a figure whose intellect was shaping the very future of warfare. He felt a wave of nausea so profound, he thought he might be sick. It was not just the fear of consequence, it was the soul-crushing weight of his own monumental, catastrophic ignorance. He had been a dog barking at the moon, a child throwing stones at a mountain, so blinded by his own petty prejudices that he had failed to recognize the master who had walked into his house. The crisis was over. The storm eventually blew itself out, leaving behind a world scoured clean and a silence that felt heavier than the noise that had preceded it. Engineers and technicians from across the base descended on the maintenance bay, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief as they looked at Sharma's improvised bypass, a masterpiece of battlefield engineering that was already becoming the stuff of instant legend. The colonel, after receiving a blistering encrypted call from a 3-star general at CENTCOM, who demanded to know why a Tier 1 asset was being exposed to haboobs and generator explosions, was now treating Sharma with the terrified deference usually reserved for visiting senators. But Sharma was not focused on the colonel, or the repairs, or the storm. After giving a calm, precise, and highly technical debrief to the engineering teams, she turned her attention, at last, back to Staff Sergeant Rex Thorne. He was standing where she had left him, a statue of shame, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. The rest of his crew huddled in a corner, avoiding his gaze, avoiding hers, wishing the earth would swallow them whole. She walked toward him, her footsteps quiet on the gritty floor. She stopped a few feet away, her expression as unreadable as ever. This was the moment Thorne had been dreading. The screaming, the charges, the court-martial, the end of his career. He braced for it, but she did not raise her voice. Her tone was clinical, the detached curiosity of a scientist examining a failed experiment. Your response to the initial power failure was incorrect, Staff Sergeant, she began, her voice calm and even. You defaulted to a standard emergency protocol that the system's own diagnostic logs would have told you was already compromised by the cascading voltage spikes from Generator 3. Your failure to accurately diagnose the root cause of the crisis placed this entire facility and the lives of its 1,200 inhabitants at unacceptable risk. She was not talking about the haircut. She was not talking about his insults or his bullying. She was dissecting his professional failure, piece by excruciating piece. It was 1,000 times more devastating than any personal attack could have been. Your leadership during the crisis, she continued, her gaze unwavering, was a textbook example of command panic. You issued loud, contradictory orders that increased the confusion and wasted critical time. Your men were disorganized and ineffective because their leader was disorganized and ineffective. You allowed your emotional state to dictate your tactical response. That is not leadership. That is a liability. Each word was a perfectly placed blow, dismantling not just his pride but his very identity. He was a leader. He was a master mechanic. These were the pillars of his existence, and she was showing him that they were built on sand. But your most critical failure, she said, her voice dropping slightly, drawing him in, occurred days ago. It was a failure of intelligence, a failure of assessment. You made an assumption based on incomplete and biased data. You saw my gender, my quiet demeanor, and my lack of immediate aggressive action, and you concluded that I was non-threatening, incompetent, and irrelevant. You allowed your prejudice to create a catastrophic blind spot. You did not see a fellow soldier. You did not see a superior officer. You saw a target for your own insecurities. Your inability to see what was right in front of you is a tactical flaw, Staff Sergeant. And in our line of work, tactical flaws get people killed. She paused, letting the weight of her diagnosis settle upon him. Thorne could not meet her eyes. He stared at the floor, at the fallen braid of hair that someone had swept into a corner. He saw it now, not as a trophy, but as an indictment. Colonel Matheson, his face flushed with fury on her behalf, finally strode forward. Thorne, you are finished. I will see you court-martialed for this. Assault, insubordination, conduct unbecoming. Master Chief, take this man into custody. Vance moved to obey, his expression grim. But Sharma held up a hand. That will not be necessary, Colonel. Matheson stopped, confused again. Ma'am, after what he did, the disrespect, the humiliation. The humiliation is irrelevant, Sharma said, her gaze still locked on Thorne. A court-martial is a punishment. Punishment is an inefficient tool for education. Staff Sergeant Thorne does not need to be broken. He needs to be rebuilt. She turned her head slightly, addressing the colonel but still speaking for Thorne's benefit. With your permission, Colonel, I am officially requisitioning Staff Sergeant Thorne for the remainder of my deployment. He is being reassigned. Effective immediately, he is my new executive assistant. A stunned silence fell over the room. Reassigned as her assistant? Thorne looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. He will carry my diagnostic kit, Sharma stated, her voice leaving no room for argument. He will observe my work. He will fetch my coffee. He will learn the schematics for every system I evaluate, and I will quiz him on them daily. He will stand behind me and watch, and he will learn the difference between loud noise and quiet competence. He will learn that respect is not demanded, it is earned through action, and he will learn that the most dangerous thing on any battlefield is an assumption. His education begins now, that is all. It was not a reprieve, it was a life sentence to be served in a prison of his own making. It was a far more profound and terrible punishment than a stockade could ever be. He would be forced every single day to confront the living embodiment of his own catastrophic failure, to witness the quiet, effortless brilliance he had been too blind to see. He would be humbled, not once in a courtroom, but 1,000 times a day, in the silent, professional judgment of the master he had wronged. He finally understood. He was not being forgiven. He was being corrected. Years passed. The story of what happened in the maintenance bay on FOB Dagger became a a piece of institutional lore told to new NCOs at leadership academies. It was called Thorne's haircut, or sometimes the day Daedalus came to town. Like all legends, it grew with each telling, but the core truth of it, the searing moral at its heart, remained unchanged. On a polished stage, under the cool, professional lights of an auditorium, a man stood before a class of newly promoted sergeants. He was older now, his face lined with a wisdom that had been hard-earned. He wore the uniform of a master sergeant, and he carried himself with a quiet, powerful dignity. It was Rex Thorne. "There will come a time in your careers," he said, his voice calm and steady, a universe away from the roar it had once been, "when you will encounter someone who does not fit your idea of what a soldier should be. They might be too quiet, too smart, too different. They might not conform to the traditions you hold dear, and your instinct, your prejudice will be to test them, to push them, to break them down and force them into a box you understand." He paused, and his eyes swept over the young, eager faces before him. "I am here to tell you that this instinct is a poison. It is the single greatest failure of leadership, because you will not know who you are testing. You might be testing the one person who holds the key, the one person who can see the solution you are blind to, the one person who can save you and your entire command when everything goes to hell." He unconsciously raised a hand and touched the side of his own neatly trimmed hair. "I once made that mistake. I let my ego and my ignorance lead me to commit an act of profound disrespect. I tried to humiliate a quiet warrant officer because I was too stupid to see the genius standing in front of me. I thought strength was loud. I thought authority was about who had the biggest voice." He shook his head slowly. "I learned that day that true strength is quiet. True authority is competence. It speaks for itself, in a language of action that requires no translation. I learned that you do not judge a weapon by its ornamentation, but by its effect on the target." He looked out at the future leaders of his institution, his gaze intense, his mission clear. He was the cautionary tale. His own humiliation had become his greatest teaching tool. He had been rebuilt, just as she had said. The lesson he had learned in that dusty, chaotic maintenance bay had become the core of his new identity, a creed he would spend the rest of his life passing on. The narrator concludes, "For in this modern fable lies a timeless and universal truth. The world is full of noise. It is full of boastful claims and superficial judgments, of people who mistake volume for value and aggression for strength. But substance is always quiet. Mastery is serene. True competence has no need to announce itself. It is revealed in the crucible of crisis. It is the calm hand that steadies the ship in a storm, the quiet voice that speaks the critical truth in a room full of panic. We are taught to judge by appearances, by rank, by gender, by the shallow metrics of a world obsessed with style over substance. But the greatest figures, the ones who truly shape the world, are often the ones you overlook. They are the quiet professionals, the hidden masters. They do not seek the spotlight. They do not demand respect. They simply are. And their actions, when the time comes, become their argument, their biography, and their legend. Let that be the lesson. Look past the noise. Seek out the quiet competence. For in the stillness, you will find the strength that truly matters.